I am Jim Drummond. I am the Quality Assurance Manager for Canadian Maritime Engineering's West Coast Division. Canadian Maritime Engineering is a full-service marine repair company as well as dismantling. We do all kinds of marine repairs from machining to dockings, haul-outs, major refits on vessels from 50 feet up to 400 or 500 feet coast to coast. The Nanaimo Yard is capable of handling a variety of vessels from small harbor craft, tugs and barges, to ocean-going ships. We're currently operating with a starting crew of about 6, and that expands to anywhere between 12 and 20 depending on the projects that we'll have in through the door. The Vicky Lynn project, we had 15 full-time. Canadian waterways face a bit of a challenge. For quite a number of years, it's been an acceptable practice to moor a boat unattended and leave it. Some of them are full of hydrocarbons, others were just loaded with garbage. The federal government has empowered other agencies to be able to act on their behalf and start ordering the removal of these vessels. Vicky Lynn was one of those boats, and it had sat in what's called Dog Patch in Ladysmith Harbor for quite a number of years. Reared its ugly head as a potential environmental disaster waiting to happen. The federal government, at the behest of the local MP, put out to tender the contract to dispose of Vicky Lynn. And that was a bit of a challenge because Vicky Lynn couldn't be disposed of where it sat. Half of our crew went out to the ship to remediate before we towed it. And the other half of the crew stayed here in Nanaimo and reactivated an old shipyard that hadn't been used for quite a number of years. So by the time Vicky Lynn actually arrived here, the shipyard was up and running and the cradle was recertified and we had all of our safety measures in place and we were ready to roll on it. When Vicky Lynn arrived in Nanaimo, it had been subject to hourly vessel rounds to make sure that there was no ingress of water or any pollutants reaching the environment before we were able to get it up on land and contain it. We pulled the boat out on the cradle and about 10 guys were involved in that, making sure that it landed properly on the cradle. Our dockmaster controlled the show and we brought it up without a hitch. Once we had it up on the cradle and it was all secured, we protected the environment by putting environmental boom in behind the boat, and we had spill response plan in place just in case rainwaters flooded the compartments and oils leaked out that way. And then we brought it up on land and there was some more remediation work. There was some hazmat work. We had to remove the asbestos that was identified. We sent all sorts of samples off to the labs to get tested to make sure that we were working within not just WorkSafe BC guidelines, but also to make sure that the workers that were here knew what materials they were dealing with to mitigate all the risks that were associated with the completion of the job. Once we got the results back, we started to section the ship off. We cut holes throughout the ship so that we could have good access without having to work in confined spaces, taking the workers' safety into consideration. And we started taking pieces off. The mast came off. We had to keep the deck covered because, again, there was a bunch of hydrocarbons, particularly in the engine room. And we just kept on chipping away at it. We cut it into chunks big enough to be craned away. And we dropped those chunks down onto the cradle beside the boat and we cut those into smaller chunks so that they would fit into bins. Every time that we came across some kind of a substance in the boat where we weren't sure of its chemical composition, we sent it to the lab to have tested. The variety of tools and methods used ranged from cutting torches to plasma cutters. We had a small excavator that we actually craned into the fish hold to dig out the foam. And we had bins dropped off that we kept on craning pieces to fit into the bins and we'd get it hauled away. Typically when they build a boat, the first piece that they cast is the keel. So it was fitting on Vicky Lynn that we left a piece of the keel to be the last piece lifted off because that's how its life started. I can say that the crew was generally elated to get to the end of the project, For some of them, it meant that there was no work for tomorrow, but for the vast majority of them, the Vicky Lynn was a project that enabled the startup of the Nanaimo yard as we see it today. Deconstructing of this vessel took approximately 12 weeks from the time we towed it from the Ladysmith Harbor to the time that we took the last bin away from this yard. The range of skills required to complete this project included boat and equipment operators, divers, welders and fabricators, and laborers. We also provide painting and electrical services, wood construction and finishing, pipe fitting, and engineering services. Almost all of the guys are from Nanaimo. We used as many local suppliers as we could to acquire all the materials that we required for the job. And the feedback that we got from the community as they dropped in to see what the activity was about was all positive. We've got good relationships with all of the local governments, and we're just trying to restart this old shipyard from the ground up. The directive from the federal government is that we need to start to build an industry in Canada that addresses this issue rather than sending the problems overseas. So the disposal of the Vicky Lynn was in effect a model that we've completed on the West Coast to demonstrate the proper way to dispose of a ship using environmentally sound and safe practices so that our workers are protected and our environment's protected.